Number 1. The Facebook check-in bank robber. In September 2015, Jules Baller walked into a bank in Cheshire, Connecticut with what he thought was a foolproof plan, but his fatal mistake wasn't in the execution of the robbery itself, it was in his compulsive need to document his whereabouts on social media. Baller, a 21-year-old from Torrington, Connecticut, had been struggling financially and decided that robbing a bank would solve his problems. So on September 17th, he entered the People's United Bank on South Main Street in Cheshire, approached the teller, and handed over a note demanding cash while implying he had a weapon. The teller, following protocol, complied with his demands and handed over several $1,000s in cash, and Baller quickly left the bank, believing he had pulled off the perfect crime. However, what Baller didn't realize was that in the moments before and after the robbery, he had checked in on Facebook at various locations near the bank, creating a digital breadcrumb trail that investigators would later describe as gift-wrapped evidence. The Cheshire Police Department responded to the bank's alarm and began their investigation immediately, reviewing surveillance footage that showed a young man matching Baller's description. And while they initially had limited leads, a detective assigned to the case decided to search social media for anyone who had checked in near the bank around the time of the robbery. Within hours, they discovered Baller's Facebook profile, which not only showed him checking in at locations within blocks of the bank at the exact time of the robbery, but also featured photos of him wearing the same distinctive clothing visible in the surveillance footage. The detective couldn't believe what he was seeing, later telling reporters that in his 20 years of law enforcement, he had never encountered a criminal who had essentially created their own timeline of guilt and posted it publicly for the world to see. Armed with this information, investigators obtained a warrant for Baller's arrest and tracked him down within 24 hours of the robbery. When they knocked on his door, Baller initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with the Facebook evidence and surveillance images, he broke down and confessed, admitting that he had been so nervous during and after the robbery that he hadn't even thought about his phone or social media, acting purely on autopilot in his normal routine of constantly updating his location online. During the subsequent search of his residence, investigators found the stolen money, still largely intact, hidden in his bedroom, along with the clothing he had worn during the robbery. Baller was charged with first-degree robbery and second-degree larceny, serious felonies that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison. His defense attorney attempted to argue for leniency based on Baller's age and lack of prior serious criminal history, but prosecutors pointed to the premeditated nature of the crime, the fear instilled in bank employees, and the defendant's own social media posts as evidence of his consciousness of guilt despite his amateur execution. In March 2016, Baller accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, suspended after 2 years served, followed by 5 years of probation. A sentence that the judge called merciful given the circumstances, but one that reflected both the seriousness of armed robbery and the defendant's ultimate cooperation with investigators. The case became something of a phenomenon in law enforcement circles and was used in training seminars as an example of how social media has fundamentally changed criminal investigations, with the Cheshire Police Department even posting about the case on their own Facebook page as a warning to would-be criminals about the permanence of digital footprints. Baller served his 2 years at a Connecticut correctional facility and was released on probation in 2018, with conditions including regular check-ins with a probation officer, mandatory employment, and ironically, restricted social media use that required approval from his probation officer before posting anything online. The case highlighted a broader trend in modern policing where criminals, particularly younger ones who have grown up with social media as an integral part of their lives, often fail to recognize how their digital presence can betray them, creating evidence that would have been impossible to obtain in previous generations. Banking security experts pointed to the case as evidence that while technology has made certain aspects of robbery more traceable, it has also created new vulnerabilities for criminals who lack the sophistication to understand that every digital action creates a permanent, time-stamped record. The psychological aspect of the case also fascinated criminologists, who noted that Baller's compulsion to check in on Facebook despite having just committed a serious felony suggested a kind of cognitive dissonance where his routine social media behavior was so ingrained that it overrode his survival instinct to avoid detection. In subsequent interviews from prison, Baller expressed deep remorse not only for the robbery itself but for the stupidity of his actions afterward, telling a local newspaper that he had thrown away his future for a few $1,000s and some Facebook likes that nobody even cared about. The teller who had been victimized by the robbery later spoke about the trauma of the experience, describing how even though Baller had seemed nervous and unprofessional during the robbery, the fear she felt was real and lasting, resulting in nightmares and anxiety about returning to work, a reminder that even bungled crimes have serious impacts on victims. The People's United Bank increased their security measures following the incident, installing additional cameras and implementing new protocols for employee safety, while the broader banking industry took note of how quickly the suspect was apprehended thanks to digital evidence. Today, the case of Jules Baller remains one of the most frequently cited examples of criminals undone by their own social media habits, referenced in criminology courses, police training programs, and even cybersecurity seminars as a cautionary tale about the intersection of technology and crime, proving that in the digital age, the impulse to share every moment of your life online can quite literally send you to prison. Number 2. The burglar who called 911 on himself. James Etter thought he had found the perfect target when he broke into a home in Fresno, California in October 2013, but his criminal enterprise would end not because of detective work or surveillance technology, but because he accidentally pocket-dialed 911 and broadcast his own crimes in real time to emergency dispatchers. Etter, a 36-year-old transient with a lengthy criminal record including prior burglary convictions, had been casing homes in a residential neighborhood in northwest Fresno, looking for properties that appeared unoccupied during daytime hours when residents were typically at work. On the morning of October 15th, he spotted a house that seemed perfect, with no cars in the driveway, newspapers piling up, and no signs of activity. So he approached the property, checked to ensure no one was home, and forced entry through a rear window, believing he had plenty of time to search for valuables before the homeowners returned. What Etter didn't know was that his cell phone, which he had stuffed into his pocket after checking it moments before, had inadvertently dialed 911, a common occurrence with older touchscreen phones that weren't properly locked. The emergency dispatcher who answered the call heard no voice on the other end, but rather than immediately disconnecting, she listened carefully as protocol required for all 911 calls, even apparent misdials, because they could indicate someone in distress who was unable to speak. What she heard instead was the sound of someone moving through a house, opening drawers, and most damningly, a male voice muttering to himself about what he was finding and where to look next. The dispatcher, a veteran of the Fresno County Emergency Communications Center with over a decade of experience, immediately recognized what she was hearing and began recording the call while simultaneously alerting police to a burglary in progress. Though initially she couldn't pinpoint the exact location because it was a cell phone call rather than a landline. For the next 12 minutes, she listened as Etter moved through the house, narrating his activities to himself in a running commentary that would later be described by the district attorney as a criminal confession delivered in real time to law enforcement. Etter could be heard discussing items he found valuable, debating whether to take certain things, and at one point even laughing about how easy the burglary was, completely unaware that every word was being captured and would later be used against him in court. Meanwhile, the dispatcher was working with technical staff to triangulate the cell phone signal, a process that typically takes several minutes but can provide location data accurate within a few hundred feet. As luck would have it, officers were already in the general area on an unrelated call, and when the triangulation data came through indicating a location in a specific residential block, they rushed to the scene, arriving at the neighborhood within 6 minutes of the initial 911 call. The dispatcher, still listening to the live audio feed, could hear Etter continuing to move through the house, and she guided responding officers by describing what she heard, including the sound of a sliding glass door that suggested which side of the house the burglar might be accessing. Officers set up a perimeter around 3 houses that fell within the triangulated location zone and began checking each one for signs of forced entry, and within minutes they found the home with the broken rear window, observed that the window screen had been removed and placed on the ground, and called for additional units before making entry. As officers entered the home with weapons drawn, they could hear movement upstairs, and they called out commands identifying themselves as police and ordering anyone inside to show themselves immediately. Etter, suddenly aware that he had been caught, panicked and tried to escape through a second-story window, but officers had already surrounded the building, and he was apprehended in the backyard as he attempted to climb down from the window. Only after he was in handcuffs did Etter realize his phone was still in his pocket, still connected to the 911 call that had now lasted over 15 minutes, and when officers retrieved the phone and saw the active call, they immediately understood what had happened. exchanging looks of disbelief before informing Etter that he had essentially called the police on himself. The homeowner, who worked as a nurse at a local hospital and had been at work during the burglary, returned home to find police cars in her driveway and officers processing her house as a crime scene. And while she was initially terrified that something terrible had happened to a family member, she felt a strange mixture of relief and amazement when she learned that the burglar had been caught in the act thanks to his own phone. Investigators recovered stolen items that Etter had collected into pillowcases, including jewelry, electronics, prescription medications, and cash, all of which were photographed and returned to the homeowner. And they also discovered that Etter had a backpack containing burglary tools including screwdrivers, gloves, and a small pry bar, evidence of his intent and preparation. The recorded 911 call became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, a 12-minute audio confession that detailed not only Etter's presence in the home but his intent to steal, his awareness of wrongdoing, and his methodical approach to the burglary. Etter's public defender attempted to have the recording suppressed, arguing that it violated his client's rights against self-incrimination, but the judge ruled that since Etter had dialed 911 himself, even accidentally, and had spoken voluntarily without any questioning from law enforcement, the recording was admissible as evidence, a ruling that was later upheld on appeal. Faced with overwhelming evidence including the audio recording, physical evidence from the scene, and officer testimony, Etter accepted a plea agreement in February 2014, pleading no contest to first-degree burglary, receiving stolen property, and possession of burglary tools. Given his extensive prior criminal history, which included 3 previous burglary convictions and multiple violations of probation, the judge showed little sympathy, sentencing Etter to 6 years in state prison with no early release eligibility, a sentence that prosecutors called appropriate for a career criminal who had shown no inclination to reform despite previous chances. During the sentencing hearing, the judge made specific reference to the 911 recording, noting that it provided an unprecedented window into the defendant's criminal mindset and complete lack of respect for others' property and privacy, and added that the only reason the sentence wasn't longer was the plea agreement that had saved the court's time and resources. The case drew significant media attention locally and nationally, with news outlets fascinated by the story of a criminal whose own phone had betrayed him, and the Fresno Police Department released portions of the 911 recording to the media, allowing the public to hear the bizarre circumstances of Etter's capture. The dispatcher who had handled the call was commended by her supervisors and later received a merit award for her quick thinking and professional handling of the unusual situation, recognizing that her decision to continue listening to what seemed like a misdial had directly resulted in the apprehension of an active burglar. Law enforcement training programs began using the case as an example of why dispatchers should never immediately disconnect on silent or unclear 911 calls, as even accidental dials can provide critical intelligence, and the case also highlighted the importance of cell phone triangulation technology in modern policing. For the homeowner, the experience was traumatic but ultimately affirming of the justice system, as she told reporters that knowing the burglar was caught and imprisoned gave her a sense of security she might not have felt if the case had gone unsolved, though she also admitted to installing a comprehensive alarm system and security cameras following the incident. Etter served his full 6-year sentence at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo and was released in 2020, with conditions of parole that included GPS monitoring, regular searches of his residence, and prohibitions on possessing any burglary tools or entering properties without explicit permission from the owners. The psychological analysis of the case suggested that Etter's habit of talking to himself during crimes might have been a form of self-soothing or confidence building, common among criminals operating alone who use verbal narration to maintain focus and reduce anxiety. But in this instance, that very habit combined with modern technology to create a perfect record of his guilt. The case remains one of the most extraordinary examples of accidental self-incrimination in modern criminal justice history, taught in law schools as an example of how technology can aid law enforcement in unexpected ways, and referenced in discussions about smartphone security and the unforeseen consequences of pocket dialing, proving that sometimes criminals need no detective to solve their crimes, they solve them perfectly well on their own. Number 3. The bank robber who wrote the note on his own deposit slip. When an unidentified man walked into a bank in Fairfield, Connecticut in January 2008, he attempted what should have been a straightforward robbery, but his choice of materials for his demand note would lead to his arrest within hours and become a textbook example of criminal incompetence. The suspect, later identified as Michael Moser, a 54-year-old construction worker who had fallen on hard times financially, entered a People's United Bank branch on Post Road during the mid-afternoon, when he knew the bank would be busy enough that he might blend in with other customers but not so crowded that he would have to wait long in line. Moser approached a teller station with what appeared to be a folded piece of paper in his hand, and when he reached the counter, he slid the paper across to the teller, a young woman who had been working at the bank for less than 6 months and had never experienced a robbery. The note, written in hasty handwriting, demanded money and implied that Moser had a weapon, though he didn't show one or make any verbal threats, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact as the teller read the message. The teller, following her training, remained calm and began gathering cash from her drawer while discreetly pressing the silent alarm button that would alert police and bank security. And within moments she handed Moser approximately $5,000 in various denominations, watching as he stuffed the bills into his jacket pockets and quickly walked out of the bank without saying a word. The entire transaction had taken less than 90 seconds, and to Moser, it must have seemed like a successful operation as he exited the building and headed to his car parked 2 blocks away, not running but walking briskly enough to put distance between himself and the crime scene. However, what Moser had failed to realize in his nervous preparation for the robbery was that he had written his demand note on the back of one of his own deposit slips, a piece of paper that contained his full name, account number, address, and phone number printed clearly at the top. The teller, after Moser left, picked up the note with trembling hands to show her supervisor, and both women immediately noticed the pre-printed information on the reverse side, information that made identifying the robber a matter of seconds rather than days or weeks of investigation. The bank manager immediately called the Fairfield Police Department, and when officers arrived minutes later, they were handed not only surveillance footage of the robbery but also a piece of paper that literally had the suspect's home address written on it. A situation one detective later described as the easiest case I've ever worked. Police drove directly to Moser's apartment in a multifamily building in nearby Bridgeport, arriving less than 2 hours after the robbery had occurred, and when they knocked on his door, Moser answered wearing different clothes than in the surveillance footage but with such a guilty expression that officers knew immediately they had their man. When asked if he had been at the People's United Bank that afternoon, Moser initially denied it, but when confronted with the deposit slip evidence and told that denying the obvious would only make things worse, he broke down completely, admitting to the robbery and explaining that he was behind on rent, facing eviction, and had made a desperate, stupid decision that he already regretted. Officers searched his apartment with his consent and found the stolen money hidden in a shoebox in his closet, still in the bank's wrapper bands, along with the jacket he had worn during the robbery, and they also found several other deposit slips from the same bank, making it clear that Moser had been a regular customer at the very institution he had chosen to rob. The irony wasn't lost on investigators, who noted that Moser had essentially robbed his own bank using materials that the bank itself had provided to him for legitimate transactions, creating a paper trail that made prosecution almost comically easy. Moser was arrested and charged with first-degree robbery, a Class B felony in Connecticut that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years and a maximum of 20 years in prison. And given the clear evidence against him, including his own identification on the demand note, his signed confession, and the recovery of the stolen money, his public defender advised him that going to trial would be pointless and potentially result in a harsher sentence. In March 2008, Moser appeared before a judge and pleaded guilty to all charges, expressing remorse and explaining his financial desperation, though the judge noted that financial hardship, while unfortunate, did not excuse terrorizing bank employees or threatening violence even implicitly. The judge also commented on the remarkable stupidity of using a personalized deposit slip for a demand note, suggesting that this level of poor planning indicated someone acting impulsively rather than as a career criminal, a factor that ultimately influenced the sentencing. Moser was sentenced to 7 years in prison, suspended after serving 4 years, followed by 5 years of probation, a sentence that the judge described as balancing the seriousness of the crime with the defendant's lack of prior violent offenses and his genuine remorse. The bank teller who had been victimized in the robbery later spoke about her experience in an interview with a local newspaper, explaining that while the quick resolution had been satisfying and had helped her feel safer, the experience of being threatened, even by someone as incompetent as Moser, had been genuinely frightening and had made her question whether she wanted to continue working in banking. The People's United Bank reviewed its security procedures following the incident but found that everything had been handled correctly, and the only change they implemented was additional training for tellers on how to discreetly observe and remember details about robbery suspects. Though in this case such training had been unnecessary given the suspect's own documentation. The case became famous in law enforcement circles and was featured in police training materials as an example of gift-wrapped cases, where criminals essentially solve their own crimes, and it was also used in banking security seminars as a somewhat humorous but genuine example of how robberies are often committed by desperate amateurs rather than sophisticated criminals. Criminologists who studied the case noted that Moser's mistake revealed the psychological state of many first-time bank robbers, who are so focused on the immediate goal of obtaining money and so overwhelmed by nerves that they fail to think through basic operational security, making elementary mistakes that professional criminals would never commit. The psychological profile developed from Moser's case suggested that he was suffering from acute financial stress combined with poor impulse control, leading to a decision made in desperation rather than careful planning, and indeed, Moser's own statements to police supported this interpretation, as he admitted he had thought of robbing the bank for only about 2 days before acting on the impulse. During his imprisonment, Moser participated in educational and vocational training programs and worked with a prison psychologist to address his decision-making patterns and financial literacy, and by all accounts he became a model prisoner who expressed genuine remorse for his actions and worked to ensure he would never return to criminal behavior. Upon his release in 2012 after serving his 4-year sentence, Moser faced the significant challenge of rebuilding his life with a felony conviction on his record, but he was able to find work in construction through a program that helps formerly incarcerated individuals find employment, and he has reportedly remained crime-free since his release, becoming a case study in successful rehabilitation. The deposit slip he used for his demand note was preserved as evidence and later became something of a curiosity piece in law enforcement museums and training facilities. A physical reminder that criminals often become the architects of their own downfall through remarkably simple oversights. The case has been referenced in numerous articles and books about crime and punishment, usually in sections dealing with dumb criminal stories, though legal experts note that behind the humor of the situation lies a serious crime that caused real trauma to bank employees and could have ended much worse if Moser had actually been armed or willing to use violence. Today, more than 15 years after the robbery, the case of Michael Moser remains one of the most frequently cited examples of criminal stupidity, a reminder that while sophisticated criminals using advanced technology and careful planning pose significant challenges to law enforcement, the vast majority of crimes are committed by people whose lack of foresight and preparation make them relatively easy to catch, and sometimes, as in Moser's case, they quite literally hand investigators everything needed for conviction, proving that the most dangerous enemy a criminal faces isn't always the police, but their own poor judgment. Number 4. The graffiti artist who tagged his own name. In the early morning hours of March 2019, a serial vandal had been plaguing the city of Fullerton, California, spray painting elaborate graffiti tags on buildings, bridges, and public infrastructure throughout the downtown area, causing tens of thousands of dollars in damage and frustrating both property owners and law enforcement who had struggled for months to identify the perpetrator. The graffiti, while artistically sophisticated in some respects, was appearing with increasing frequency, sometimes multiple locations in a single night, and the tags always featured the same distinctive style and signature symbol that investigators believed could eventually lead them to the artist if they could decode its meaning. Daniel Chacon, a 21-year-old aspiring graffiti artist who went by several street names in the local tagging community, had been careful throughout his vandalism spree to avoid cameras, work during late-night hours when streets were empty, and never tag anywhere near his own neighborhood, following what he believed were the basic rules of successful illegal graffiti work that would keep him anonymous and free from prosecution. However, on the night of March 23rd, Chacon made a decision that would unravel months of careful operational security and lead to his arrest within 48 hours, when he chose to spray paint his own legal name, Daniel Chacon, in massive 6-foot letters on the side of a prominent building on Harbor Boulevard, one of Fullerton's main thoroughfares. The building, a commercial property housing several businesses, had security cameras that Chacon either didn't notice or chose to ignore in his apparent desire to create his most visible and bold piece yet, and the cameras captured clear footage of him spending nearly 30 minutes carefully painting his name in elaborate lettering, complete with decorative elements and his signature symbol that had appeared at dozens of other vandalism sites throughout the city. The property owner discovered the graffiti the following morning when arriving to open his business and immediately called the Fullerton Police Department, and when officers arrived to take a report and review the security footage, they could hardly believe what they were seeing, as the suspect had literally written out his identification in letters large enough to be seen from blocks away. Detective Maria Gonzalez, who had been assigned to investigate the serial graffiti case for the previous 4 months, was called to the scene, and when she saw the name painted on the building, her first reaction was to assume it must be a nickname or alias, because surely no criminal would be foolish enough to write their actual legal name at a crime scene. However, when she ran the name Daniel Chacon through the department's database along with the approximate age of the suspect visible in the security footage, she found an exact match. A 21-year-old male living in nearby Anaheim with a prior arrest for minor vandalism 2 years earlier, complete with booking photos that matched the physical appearance of the person in the security video. Gonzalez and her partner drove to Chacon's apartment that same afternoon, and when they knocked on the door, they were greeted by Chacon himself, who was wearing paint-stained clothes and had spray paint residue still visible on his hands, and when asked if he was Daniel Chacon, he confirmed his identity, still apparently unaware that he was about to be arrested for the very crime he had literally signed his name to. Officers asked if they could come inside to talk, and Chacon, perhaps believing he could talk his way out of whatever minor issue they were investigating, invited them in, where they immediately observed numerous cans of spray paint in colors matching those used in graffiti throughout Fullerton, photographs of tagged locations pinned to his walls like trophies, and sketches and plans for future graffiti pieces, essentially turning his apartment into a museum of his own criminal activity. When detectives informed Chacon that they were investigating vandalism at the Harbor Boulevard location and asked if he knew anything about it, he initially denied involvement, but when shown a photograph of his own name painted on the building in letters 6 feet tall, he sat down heavily on his couch, put his head in his hands, and said simply, "I'm an idiot," before requesting an attorney. Despite lawyering up at that moment, the evidence against Chacon was so overwhelming that his public defender advised him that fighting the charges would be futile and would likely result in the maximum sentence, whereas accepting responsibility might earn some consideration from the court. The investigation expanded after Chacon's arrest, with detectives comparing photographs from his apartment with reports of graffiti vandalism throughout Fullerton, Anaheim, and neighboring cities, and through stylistic analysis and matching of specific design elements. They were able to connect him to 47 separate incidents of vandalism spanning an 8-month period, with total damages estimated at over $150,000, when accounting for property damage and the cost of removal or repainting. Property owners who had been victimized by the graffiti were contacted by investigators, and many expressed relief that someone had finally been caught, though they also expressed frustration that restitution would likely be minimal given that Chacon worked only sporadically and had virtually no assets. The case drew attention from the local media, with the Los Angeles Times running a story headlined "Graffiti Vandal Signs His Own Arrest Warrant," and the coverage included photographs of the massive name tag that had led to Chacon's capture, along with interviews with property owners and law enforcement about the costly impact of graffiti vandalism on communities. Chacon was charged with 47 counts of vandalism, multiple counts being felonies due to the dollar amount of damage exceeding $400 per incident as defined by California law, and he also faced potential gang enhancement charges after investigators discovered evidence that he was affiliated with a tagging crew, though those charges were ultimately dropped as part of a plea negotiation. In August 2019, Chacon appeared in Orange County Superior Court and pleaded no contest to 23 felony counts of vandalism and 24 misdemeanor counts, a plea deal that dismissed some of the most serious charges in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other taggers and his agreement to pay restitution. The judge sentenced Chacon to 3 years in state prison, but suspended the sentence in favor of 1 year in county jail, followed by 4 years of formal probation, with conditions including 1,000 hours of community service specifically involving graffiti removal, restitution payments to all identified victims on a payment plan that would likely take years to complete, and a prohibition on possessing spray paint or any graffiti-related materials. The judge, during sentencing, specifically addressed Chacon's decision to paint his own name on the building, saying, "I've seen many cases of vandalism in my years on the bench, but I've never seen a defendant quite literally sign a confession to his crimes in 6-foot letters on the side of a building. This level of poor judgment suggests either extreme arrogance or extreme stupidity, and perhaps both." Chacon served his year in county jail and was released in 2020 to begin his probation, during which time he was required to check in monthly with a probation officer who would verify his community service hours and ensure he was making restitution payments. And he was also required to stay away from known graffiti hotspots and submit to random searches of his residence and vehicle. The community service component of his sentence proved particularly fitting, as Chacon was assigned to work with the city's graffiti abatement team, spending weekends and evenings cleaning and painting over the very type of vandalism he had once created, an experience he later described in a court-ordered essay as humbling and eye-opening, as he saw firsthand the work and expense required to undo what he had done. Some of the property owners who had been victimized by Chacon's graffiti attended his sentencing hearing, and several gave victim impact statements describing the financial burden of repeated vandalism, the sense of violation when their property was defaced, and the frustration of dealing with insurance companies and cleanup costs, testimony that visibly affected Chacon, who wept as he heard the real-world consequences of what he had viewed as artistic expression. The case sparked broader discussions in Fullerton and surrounding communities about graffiti culture, the line between street art and vandalism, and how cities should respond to tagging, with some community members arguing for more legal walls where artists could create without committing crimes, while others insisted that vandalism should be prosecuted to the fullest extent regardless of artistic merit. Art experts and sociologists who studied graffiti culture noted that Chacon's case represented a common pattern where young taggers, driven by a desire for fame and recognition within their subculture, make increasingly bold and risky moves to gain status, sometimes crossing the line from calculated risk-taking into reckless behavior that makes their capture inevitable. The psychological analysis of why Chacon painted his real name, when he had successfully used pseudonyms for months, suggested a possible desire to be caught, or alternatively, an escalation of ego and invincibility complex where he believed he was untouchable and wanted to claim personal credit for his work rather than hiding behind an alias, common patterns among serial criminals of all types who eventually become overconfident. During his probation, Chacon completed a court-ordered psychological evaluation that diagnosed him with impulse control issues and a narcissistic need for recognition, and he was required to attend counseling sessions focused on decision-making and consequences, sessions that he reportedly engaged with seriously after his time in jail had given him perspective on the trajectory his life had been taking. The property owner whose building had been tagged with Chacon's name eventually had the graffiti professionally removed at a cost of over $3,000. An expense that Chacon was ordered to reimburse through his restitution plan, and ironically, the removal company took photographs of the name tag before cleaning it because the case had become somewhat famous and they wanted documentation of what they called the stupidest graffiti in California history. Chacon's case was added to law enforcement training materials on graffiti investigation, not as an example of sophisticated criminal behavior requiring complex detective work, but as a reminder that many crimes are solved simply because criminals make elementary mistakes driven by ego, poor judgment, or lack of forethought, and the case was also used in youth intervention programs as a cautionary tale about how a desire for fame and recognition can lead to criminal records and serious consequences. By 2023, Chacon had completed his probation successfully, finished his community service hours, and made substantial progress on his restitution payments, and according to his probation officer's final report, he had shown genuine rehabilitation and had channeled his artistic talents into legal murals and community art projects, even teaching art classes to at-risk youth, where he shared his story as a warning about the consequences of vandalism. The building on Harbor Boulevard where Chacon painted his name has since been renovated and no longer bears any trace of the graffiti that led to his arrest, but the security camera footage of him carefully painting his own name in massive letters remains in the Fullerton Police Department's archives, occasionally shown at community meetings and school presentations about the real costs of vandalism and the certainty that criminals will eventually be caught, especially when they quite literally advertise their identity at crime scenes. Today, the case of Daniel Chacon serves as one of the most straightforward examples of criminal self-sabotage, a situation where months of careful anonymity were undone in a single night by a decision to claim personal credit for illegal activity, and it remains a favorite story among law enforcement officers who appreciate the occasional case that solves itself through the suspect's own actions, proving that sometimes the best detective work is simply being present when criminals decide to write their own arrest warrants in 6-foot letters for the world to see. Number 5. The burglar who left his wallet at the crime scene. On a quiet Tuesday evening in January 2017, a home in the suburban community of Lake Worth, Florida became the target of what should have been a routine burglary, but the criminal's carelessness would transform it into one of the easiest cases the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office had ever investigated. Matthew McNelly, a 21-year-old with a history of petty crimes and drug offenses, had been driving through residential neighborhoods looking for opportunities when he spotted a house that appeared unoccupied. With no vehicles in the driveway, newspapers accumulating on the porch, and lights that remained off as evening approached, all signs suggesting the residents might be away on vacation or out for an extended period. McNelly parked his car a few blocks away, walked back to the target house, and after checking to ensure no neighbors were watching, forced entry through a rear sliding glass door that he was able to jimmy open without triggering any alarm, a technique he had learned from other petty criminals and had used successfully in previous burglaries. Once inside, McNelly began his systematic search of the residence, starting with the master bedroom where people typically kept jewelry, cash, and other valuables, and he worked quickly but methodically, checking dresser drawers, closets, and nightstands while also keeping an ear out for any sounds that might indicate someone returning home or neighbors investigating suspicious activity. What McNelly didn't realize was that the homeowners, a retired couple named Richard and Martha Stevens, had only gone out to dinner at a restaurant less than a mile away and would be returning within the hour, having left their cars in the garage rather than the driveway due to an approaching rainstorm, which explained why McNelly had mistakenly believed the house was unoccupied for an extended period. As McNelly searched the bedroom, he removed his wallet from his back pocket and set it on the dresser, a common habit among burglars who find that bulky items in pockets can be uncomfortable when climbing, crawling, or moving quickly, and also because he wanted to have both hands free to sort through drawers and examine potential items to steal. He had been in the house for approximately 15 minutes and had collected several pieces of jewelry, some cash he found in a drawer, and a few small electronics when he heard the distinct sound of a garage door opening, followed immediately by voices and footsteps, signals that the homeowners had returned and were entering the house. Panic immediately set in as McNelly realized he was trapped, with the homeowners entering through the garage into the kitchen while he was upstairs in the bedroom, and his only thought was to escape as quickly as possible before being discovered. So he grabbed the items he had collected, shoved them into his pockets, and looked frantically for an escape route. The bedroom window seemed like his best option, and although it was a second-story window approximately 15 feet above the ground, McNelly decided that a potentially broken ankle was preferable to being caught in the act of burglary. So he opened the window, knocked out the screen, and jumped, landing hard on the lawn below and immediately sprinting toward where he had left his car, running through yards and jumping fences in his desperation to put distance between himself and the crime scene. Meanwhile, Richard Stevens, having entered the house and immediately sensing something wrong based on the open bedroom door and disturbed appearance of rooms, called out to see if anyone was there, and when he heard no response, he walked upstairs to investigate, telling his wife to wait by the door in case they needed to leave quickly. When Richard entered the master bedroom, he immediately saw that drawers had been opened, items had been moved, and most tellingly, the bedroom window was wide open with the screen lying on the floor, evidence that someone had just been in the room and had fled moments ago, possibly even while he and his wife were pulling into the garage. Richard called 911 immediately, reporting a burglary in progress and describing what he had found, and while he was still on the phone with dispatchers, his wife called up from downstairs that she had found the sliding glass door forced open, confirming that someone had definitely broken into their home. Deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office arrived within minutes, and officers began processing the scene, looking for evidence that might help identify the burglar, and within just a few minutes of searching the bedroom, one deputy noticed a brown leather wallet sitting on top of the dresser, partially hidden by a jewelry box but clearly not belonging to the homeowners based on its worn appearance and the fact that Richard Stevens's wallet was in his own pocket. The deputy picked up the wallet using gloved hands and opened it to find a Florida driver's license with a photo and full identifying information for Matthew McNelly, including his current address in nearby West Palm Beach, along with credit cards, a social security card, and even a receipt from a gas station dated that same day, creating an evidence package so complete that it almost seemed too good to be true. The investigating detective, when informed about the wallet, initially suspected it might be a plant or some kind of setup because in his 15 years of law enforcement, he had never encountered a burglar careless enough to leave behind a wallet with complete identification. But upon reviewing all the evidence including the forced entry, the disturbed bedroom, and the fresh footprints in the yard beneath the window, He concluded that they were indeed dealing with a criminal who had simply panicked and forgotten the most important item a person carries. Deputies were dispatched immediately to the address listed on McNally's driver's license, arriving at his apartment less than 2 hours after the burglary had occurred. And when they knocked on his door, McNally answered wearing different clothes than he had worn during the burglary, but with visible scratches and bruising on his arms and legs consistent with jumping from a second-story window and running through vegetation. And when asked if he was Matthew McNally, he confirmed his identity, with such a defeated expression that officers knew he understood why they were there. McNally was asked if he had been at a residence on Lake Osborne Drive that evening, and after a long pause, he admitted that yes, he had been there, and when asked what he was doing at that location, he initially tried to claim he had been invited by friends, but when confronted with the fact that his wallet had been found at the scene of a burglary and that the homeowners had no idea who he was, he gave up the pretense and admitted to the break-in, explaining that he had panicked when the residents came home and had run without thinking, only realizing hours later that his wallet was missing. A search of McNally's apartment, conducted with his consent after he was advised that refusing would only delay the inevitable warrant, revealed the jewelry and cash stolen from the Stevens residence, still in McNally's pockets from his hasty flight, along with property from at least 3 other burglaries that detectives had been investigating in the area, suggesting that McNally had been responsible for a small crime spree over the previous weeks. McNally was arrested and charged with burglary of an occupied dwelling, a first-degree felony in Florida carrying a potential sentence of up to life in prison due to the serious nature of breaking into a home while people are present or could reasonably be expected to return. And he also faced additional charges for the other stolen property found in his possession, as well as possession of burglary tools after officers found a small pry bar and screwdrivers in his car. The Stevens couple, while shaken by the experience of having their home invaded and knowing they had come within minutes of potentially confronting a burglar, expressed relief that the suspect had been caught so quickly and that their property had been recovered, though Martha Stevens later told reporters that she would never feel completely safe in the house again and that they had invested in a comprehensive security system with cameras and motion sensors following the incident. The case against McNally was so strong, with his wallet serving as irrefutable proof of his presence at the crime scene along with his own confession and the recovered stolen property, that his public defender advised him that taking the case to trial would be suicidal and would likely result in the maximum sentence, whereas accepting a plea deal might result in some consideration for his cooperation and the return of the victim's property. In April 2017, McNally appeared in Palm Beach County Circuit Court and pleaded guilty to burglary of an occupied dwelling and 3 counts of grand theft related to the other stolen property found in his possession, and the judge, while noting that McNally's criminal history showed a pattern of poor decisions and disregard for others' property, also acknowledged that this was his first violent felony and that he had shown some remorse and cooperation after his arrest. McNally was sentenced to 5 years in Florida State Prison followed by 5 years of probation, a sentence that the judge described as lenient given the seriousness of invading someone's home, but appropriate given the defendant's age and the fact that no one had been physically harmed during the burglary, though the judge warned McNally that any future offenses would result in significantly harsher punishment. During his sentencing hearing, McNally was given the opportunity to address the court, and he apologized directly to the Stevens family, who were present in the courtroom, admitting that his drug addiction had driven him to burglary and that leaving his wallet at the scene was the stupidest thing I've ever done. But maybe it was supposed to happen so I would get caught and get help before I did something even worse. The wallet that McNally had left behind was entered into evidence and remained in police custody throughout the trial, and photographs of it became part of the case file that was later used in law enforcement training as an example of how criminals often make elementary mistakes under pressure, with instructors pointing out that panic and poor planning are the downfall of most amateur criminals. The case received local media coverage with headlines like "Burglar Leaves Behind Calling Card," "His Wallet," and "Criminal Forgets Most Important Item During Break-In." And the story was picked up by national news aggregators as an example of criminal incompetence, though legal experts noted that behind the somewhat humorous circumstances was a serious crime that had traumatized the victims and deserved appropriate punishment. McNally served his full 5-year sentence at Okeechobee Correctional Institution, where he participated in drug treatment programs and vocational training, and according to prison records, he earned his GED and completed courses in carpentry and electrical work, skills he hoped would help him find legitimate employment upon release and avoid returning to criminal activity. The Stevens family recovered all of their stolen property and worked with victim services advocates to process the trauma of the burglary. And while they initially considered moving to a different home, they ultimately decided to stay but made significant security upgrades including reinforced doors and windows, a monitored alarm system, and security cameras covering all entry points to their property. Palm Beach County investigators were able to clear 3 additional burglary cases based on property found in McNally's possession and his subsequent cooperation in identifying fences and other criminals he had worked with, leading to several other arrests and helping to reduce the area's burglary rate. A silver lining to the case that law enforcement appreciated even as they marveled at McNally's carelessness. Upon his release in 2022, McNally was placed on probation with strict conditions including regular drug testing, employment requirements, GPS monitoring for the first year, and prohibitions on going near any property he didn't live in or have explicit permission to visit. And according to his probation officer's reports, he has remained compliant and found work in construction, though rebuilding his life with a felony record has proven challenging. The case has been referenced in numerous articles and books about crime and criminal psychology, usually in sections dealing with how stress and panic cause criminals to make irrational decisions and critical mistakes, and criminologists have used it as an example of how the cognitive load of committing a crime, combined with the sudden emergency of needing to flee, can cause even basic tasks like remembering one's possessions to become impossible. Today, more than 7 years after the burglary, the case of Matthew McNally and his forgotten wallet remains one of the most frequently cited examples of criminal carelessness. A reminder that while some criminals are sophisticated and difficult to catch, many are simply amateurs whose poor planning and panic-driven decisions make them easy to identify and prosecute. And in this case, the forgotten wallet wasn't just evidence of a crime, but a perfect metaphor for how criminals often leave behind pieces of themselves in ways they never intended, ensuring that justice catches up with them regardless of how far or fast they run. Number 6. The drug dealer who texted the police chief. In November 2016, a drug dealer operating in Granbury, Texas made what would become one of the most infamous mistakes in the history of law enforcement communications when he accidentally sent a text message offering to sell methamphetamine not to a customer or associate, but directly to the chief of police for the city of Granbury. William Lambdin Jr., a 29-year-old with an extensive criminal history including previous drug convictions, had been dealing methamphetamine in the Hood County area for several months, using cell phone text messages to communicate with his customer base, arrange sales, and coordinate deliveries, a common practice among low-level drug dealers who believe that text messages are more discreet than phone calls and harder for law enforcement to intercept in real time. On the evening of November 14th, Lambdin was going through his contact list sending out what dealers call blast texts. Mass messages sent to multiple customers simultaneously announcing that he had product available for sale and offering special deals or discounts, a marketing technique that dealers use to move inventory quickly and maintain regular customer contact. However, in his haste to send these messages, Lambdin made a catastrophic error in selecting recipients from his contact list, accidentally including a number that he had apparently saved at some point without realizing whose phone it actually was, and that number belonged to Chief Mitch Galvin of the Granbury Police Department. Chief Galvin was at home that evening when his phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and when he looked at the screen, he was surprised to see a message from an unknown number that read, "You want some ice? I got that fire ice, 50 a gram. Hit me up." Using street terminology where ice refers to methamphetamine and the message was clearly an offer to sell illegal drugs, Galvin's first reaction was confusion, wondering if this was some kind of prank or wrong number. But when he examined the message more carefully and noted the specific drug terminology and pricing information, he realized that he had just received a genuine offer to purchase methamphetamine from someone who had no idea they were texting the chief of police. Rather than immediately responding, Galvin contacted the narcotics investigators in his department and showed them the message, and together they devised a plan to respond to the text as if Galvin were interested in making a purchase. Hoping to arrange a meeting where they could identify and arrest the dealer, Galvin texted back, "How much for 8 ball?" using the street term for 3.5 grams of methamphetamine, a quantity that would constitute a significant drug transaction, and within minutes, Lambdin responded with pricing and asked where Galvin wanted to meet, apparently still completely unaware that he was negotiating a drug sale with the chief of police. Over the next hour, Galvin and Lambdin exchanged multiple text messages arranging the details of the transaction, with Lambdin agreeing to meet at a gas station on Highway 377, and throughout this exchange, Lambdin showed no suspicion or awareness that anything was amiss, confidently providing details about the quality of his product and even offering to front part of the purchase if the buyer became a regular customer. Undercover narcotics officers were dispatched to the designated meeting location well in advance, setting up surveillance positions where they could observe the parking lot and surrounding area without being detected, and they were instructed to move in and make the arrest as soon as Lambdin arrived and confirmed he was there for the drug transaction. At the agreed-upon time, a vehicle matching the description Lambdin had provided pulled into the gas station parking lot, and the driver, later confirmed to be Lambdin, sent a text message to Galvin's phone saying, "I'm here, where you at?" giving officers confirmation that they had the right person. Undercover officers, dressed in plain clothes and driving unmarked vehicles, approached Lambdin's car from multiple directions, and when they identified themselves as police and ordered him to exit the vehicle, Lambdin's expression reportedly went from confidence to absolute horror as he realized what had happened. A search of Lambdin's vehicle yielded approximately 10 grams of methamphetamine packaged for sale, a digital scale with drug residue, numerous small plastic bags commonly used for packaging drugs, $600 in cash in small denominations consistent with drug sales, and most damningly, the cell phone from which he had sent the text messages to Chief Galvin, with the entire conversation still visible on the screen. Lambdin was arrested and charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver, a first-degree felony in Texas carrying a potential sentence of 5 to 99 years in prison, and investigators immediately began examining his phone records and text message history to identify his customer base and suppliers, an investigation that would ultimately lead to several additional arrests in the area's drug network. During his initial interview with investigators, Lambdin was asked how he had obtained Chief Galvin's cell phone number, and he claimed he had no idea whose number it was and must have gotten it confused with a customer's number at some point, though investigators suspected he might have obtained it from someone who had legitimate business with the police department and had given Lambdin what he thought was a personal number for communication, never imagining it would be used to offer illegal drugs to the chief of police. The Hood County District Attorney's Office, recognizing the unusual circumstances and the publicity value of the case, held a press conference to announce Lambdin's arrest, with Chief Galvin himself presenting the facts of the case and showing reporters the actual text message exchange on his phone, creating what one journalist described as the most ironic drug bust in Texas history. The story quickly went viral on social media and was picked up by news outlets across the country and internationally, with headlines like "Drug Dealer Texts Police Chief Offering Meth for Sale" and "Criminal Makes Worst Text Mistake Ever." And the case became a sensation that generated both humor at Lambdin's expense and serious discussions about how criminals use technology and how often they make critical mistakes. Legal experts noted that Lambdin's case was particularly strong for prosecution because the text messages created a clear paper trail of intent to distribute drugs. There was no question of entrapment since Lambdin had initiated the contact, and the drugs and paraphernalia found in his vehicle corroborated the text message evidence, making conviction virtually certain if the case went to trial. Lambdin's defense attorney faced an almost impossible task of building any kind of defense given the overwhelming evidence, and after reviewing the text messages, the drugs seized from the vehicle, and his client's previous criminal history, he advised Lambdin that accepting a plea deal would be his only realistic option to avoid spending decades in prison. In February 2017, Lambdin appeared in Hood County District Court and pleaded guilty to possession with intent to deliver methamphetamine, and in exchange for his plea and cooperation in identifying other dealers in the area, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence at the lower end of the statutory range rather than seeking the maximum penalty. The judge sentenced Lambdin to 15 years in Texas State Prison with the possibility of parole after serving half the sentence, a punishment that the judge described as necessary to protect the community from drug trafficking, while also acknowledging that Lambdin's cooperation and guilty plea had saved the court's time and resources. Though the judge couldn't resist commenting that texting the chief of police to offer drugs was, perhaps, the most foolish thing a criminal could do, and suggested it demonstrated poor judgment that extended well beyond this single incident. During the sentencing hearing, Chief Galvin gave a statement to the court describing how drug trafficking affects communities, the violence and property crime that accompanies methamphetamine distribution, and the lives destroyed by addiction, and he noted that while Lambdin's mistake had been almost comically stupid, the drugs he was selling were deadly serious and had likely contributed to addiction and suffering in Hood County. Lambdin was given an opportunity to address the court, and he apologized for his actions while also trying to explain that his own addiction to methamphetamine had driven him to deal drugs to support his habit, a common claim among low-level dealers that judges hear frequently and that rarely results in sympathy or reduced sentences. And indeed, the judge responded that addiction, while unfortunate, does not excuse contributing to others' addiction through distribution. The case became a favorite in law enforcement training seminars and conferences, with instructors using it as an example of how criminals often make absurd mistakes that hand investigators easy cases, and it was also used in discussions about how technology creates new vulnerabilities for criminals who rely on cell phones and text messages without understanding how easily those communications can be traced and used as evidence. Chief Galvin kept screenshots of the original text message exchange and has reportedly shown them at various community meetings and school presentations as part of drug awareness programs. Using Lambdin's mistake as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of drug dealing and as an example of how law enforcement uses every tool and opportunity available to combat drug trafficking. The Granbury Police Department experienced a brief surge in media attention following the case, with Chief Galvin giving interviews to local and national media outlets about the unusual circumstances and about the broader challenges of combating methamphetamine trafficking in smaller Texas communities, and he used the platform to discuss how drug problems that were once considered primarily urban issues had spread to rural areas and small towns, creating new challenges for law enforcement agencies with limited resources. Lambdin is currently serving his sentence at a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility, and according to prison records, he has participated in substance abuse treatment programs and has maintained a relatively clean disciplinary record, though he will not be eligible for parole until 2025 at the earliest, and upon release he will face years of supervised parole during which he will be subject to random drug testing, employment requirements, and restrictions on his movements and associations. The customers who had been receiving Lambdin's blast texts offering drugs were identified through his phone records, and while most were not prosecuted due to lack of evidence that they had actually purchased drugs, several were visited by police and warned that they were known to be associating with drug dealers, a tactic that Hood County law enforcement hopes will discourage drug use and make the area less hospitable to dealers. The case has been referenced in numerous articles and academic papers about criminal psychology and decision-making, with researchers noting that Lambdin's mistake represented a failure of attention and caution that is common among criminals who become comfortable with their illegal activities and begin to take shortcuts or become careless in ways that inevitably lead to their capture. Today, more than 7 years after William Lambdin accidentally texted the Granbury Chief of Police offering to sell methamphetamine, the case remains one of the most famous examples of criminal stupidity in modern law enforcement history, a story that is simultaneously amusing for its absurdity and sobering for its reminder that drug dealing, regardless of how incompetently executed, destroys lives and communities, and that law enforcement agencies, sometimes through extraordinary skill and sometimes through extraordinary luck when criminals essentially arrest themselves through their own mistakes, are constantly working to identify and prosecute those who profit from addiction and suffering, proving that in the age of digital communication, criminals face not only traditional investigative techniques but also the constant risk that their own technology will become the instrument of their downfall, and that sometimes the person on the other end of a text message offering illegal drugs isn't a customer looking to buy, but a police chief looking to make an arrest. Number 7. The car thief who returned to the victim's house. In August 2018, a car theft in Tulsa, Oklahoma took an unexpected turn when the thief made the inexplicable decision to return to the victim's house multiple times after stealing the vehicle, ultimately leading to his arrest in circumstances that law enforcement described as almost unbelievably stupid. Jeremiah Thomas, a 28-year-old with previous convictions for theft and burglary, had been prowling through a middle-class neighborhood in South Tulsa looking for unlocked vehicles or easy theft opportunities when he came across a 2015 Honda Accord parked in the driveway of a house on East 71st Street. The homeowner, Jennifer Martinez, a single mother who worked as a nurse at a local hospital, had made the common mistake of leaving her car unlocked with the keys inside after unloading groceries late one evening. and she had gone inside intending to retrieve them but had gotten distracted with her children's bedtime routines and forgotten about the keys until the next morning. Thomas, who had been walking through the neighborhood specifically looking for such opportunities, spotted the Honda around 2 in the morning and checked the doors to find it unlocked, and upon searching the interior, he found the keys in the center console along with a garage door opener clipped to the sun visor, a discovery that should have made him immediately suspicious about returning to this property, but instead seemed to give him ideas about future opportunities. Thomas drove away in the stolen Honda without any difficulty, and by the time Martinez discovered her car missing the next morning and called the Tulsa Police Department to report the theft, Thomas was already across town at a known chop shop discussing whether to sell the vehicle for parts or keep it for his own use, ultimately deciding to keep it temporarily since it was in good condition and not immediately identifiable as stolen unless someone ran the license plates. However, over the next several days, Thomas made a series of decisions that defied all logic and common sense for a car thief trying to avoid detection, when he began driving past Martinez's house repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single day, apparently to see if there were other vehicles or opportunities worth pursuing at the property. On the third day after the theft, Martinez happened to be arriving home from work when she noticed her stolen Honda driving slowly past her house, and she immediately recognized the vehicle from its distinctive bumper stickers and a small dent on the rear quarter panel. And she could clearly see that a young man she didn't recognize was driving her car, looking at her house as he drove past. Martinez, shocked and angered by the audacity of the thief, immediately called 911 and followed the Honda in her husband's truck, maintaining visual contact while providing updates to the police dispatcher about their location and direction of travel. And within minutes, Tulsa police officers were en route to intercept the vehicle. Thomas, apparently unaware that he was being followed or that police had been called, led Martinez and the pursuing police officers on an unintentional chase through the neighborhood before eventually pulling into a convenience store parking lot. And when officers arrived with lights and sirens activated, he initially attempted to flee on foot, but was quickly tackled and apprehended by officers who had surrounded the vehicle. A search of the stolen Honda revealed that Thomas had been living in the car since stealing it, with clothes, food wrappers, drug paraphernalia, and personal items scattered throughout the interior, and investigators also found Martinez's garage door opener still clipped to the visor, along with a GPS device she had kept in the glove compartment and various personal items that she had left in the vehicle, all of which Thomas had apparently felt entitled to keep and use. During his interview with detectives, Thomas was asked the obvious question of why he had repeatedly returned to the victim's house after stealing her car, behavior that almost guaranteed he would eventually be seen and identified, and his answer was shockingly simple. He claimed he had noticed that Martinez also had a motorcycle in her garage, visible through the window, and he had been planning to use the garage door opener to break in and steal the motorcycle as well, but he wanted to watch the house for a few days to learn the family's schedule and determine the best time to strike. This admission, which detectives found almost impossible to believe given how risky and unnecessary it was, demonstrated a level of greed and poor judgment that went beyond typical criminal behavior, and it also provided evidence of premeditation for additional crimes that Thomas had been planning but never got the chance to commit. Thomas was charged with felony theft of a motor vehicle, possession of stolen property, possession of drug paraphernalia after methamphetamine pipes were found in the car, and eluding police officers for his brief attempt to flee on foot, charges that collectively carried potential sentences adding up to over 20 years in prison given his prior criminal history. Martinez, who had suffered significant inconvenience and expense from being without her car for several days, and who had been terrified when she realized the thief was brazenly driving her own vehicle past her house, gave a victim impact statement at Thomas's preliminary hearing in which she described feeling violated not just by the theft but by the knowledge that the thief had been surveilling her home and planning additional crimes against her family, a revelation that had made her feel unsafe in her own neighborhood and had required her to invest in security cameras and a new garage security system. The case drew attention from local media, with news outlets reporting on the unusual circumstances of a car thief repeatedly returning to his victim's house in the stolen vehicle. And crime prevention experts used the case as an example in public safety presentations about the importance of not leaving keys in vehicles and of being aware of suspicious people or vehicles in neighborhoods, while also noting that Thomas's behavior was so aberrant that it fell outside typical criminal patterns and would have been difficult to predict or prevent beyond basic security measures. Thomas's defense attorney struggled to build any kind of defense given the overwhelming evidence, including Martinez's positive identification of her own vehicle with Thomas driving it, the police pursuit and arrest, and the recovery of all the stolen property including items with Martinez's name on them, and perhaps most damagingly, Thomas's own admission that he had been planning to commit additional burglaries at the property, statements that could be used against him not only in the current case but potentially in future prosecutions if he ever did attempt such crimes. In December 2018, facing the strong case against him and the potential for a very lengthy sentence if convicted at trial, Thomas accepted a plea agreement in which he pleaded guilty to theft of a motor vehicle and possession of stolen property in exchange for having the other charges dismissed, and he was sentenced to 10 years in Oklahoma State Prison with no possibility of parole until serving at least 85% of the sentence due to the violent nature of his prior criminal history, a punishment that the judge called necessary to protect the community from someone who has repeatedly shown that he cannot respect others' property and who continues to commit crimes despite previous convictions and opportunities for rehabilitation. The judge specifically referenced Thomas's decision to repeatedly return to the victim's house, calling it evidence of either extreme stupidity or extreme arrogance, and possibly both, and noting that such behavior suggested Thomas felt entitled to victimize Martinez and her family repeatedly without consequence, an attitude that the court found particularly disturbing and worthy of a significant prison sentence. Martinez recovered her Honda Accord after it had been processed as evidence, but she reported that the experience of having someone living in her car and going through her personal belongings had made her feel so uncomfortable that she ultimately sold the vehicle and purchased a different one, unable to shake the feeling of violation every time she sat in the driver's seat where Thomas had been sitting when planning additional crimes against her family. The Tulsa Police Department used the case in community outreach programs as an example of what they called gift-wrapped cases, where criminals make such poor decisions that they essentially arrest themselves, and they emphasized to residents that while most car thieves immediately take stolen vehicles far away from the crime scene, incidents like Thomas's case, while rare, demonstrated why it's important to immediately report stolen vehicles and to remain vigilant in neighborhoods even after crimes have occurred. Thomas is currently serving his sentence at an Oklahoma correctional facility, and according to prison records, he has accumulated multiple disciplinary infractions including possession of contraband and fighting with other inmates, suggesting that he has not used his incarceration as an opportunity for rehabilitation and may face additional time added to his sentence, and upon his eventual release, he will face years of supervised parole during which any violation could send him back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Criminologists who studied the case noted that Thomas's behavior of returning to the scene of his crime repeatedly represented an unusual psychological pattern that could indicate either cognitive impairment, substance abuse affecting judgment, or a compulsive aspect to his criminal behavior that overrode normal self-preservation instincts, and some experts suggested that his planning to commit additional crimes against the same victim showed a concerning escalation that might have led to more serious offenses, including potentially violent confrontation if he had proceeded with his planned garage burglary. The motorcycle that Thomas had been planning to steal remained in Martinez's garage, but she reported that knowing it had been targeted by someone who was willing to repeatedly surveil her home had made her much more security conscious, leading her to install motion sensor lights, security cameras covering all entry points to her property, and a monitored alarm system that would alert police immediately if any future break-ins were attempted, investments that she felt were necessary to regain her sense of safety after having been victimized by someone who showed such brazen disregard for her property and well-being. Today, more than 6 years after Jeremiah Thomas stole Jennifer Martinez's car and then inexplicably returned to her house multiple times in the stolen vehicle, the case remains a bizarre footnote in Tulsa law enforcement history, referenced in police training as an example of how criminals sometimes make decisions so illogical that they defy explanation, and used in criminology discussions about how substance abuse, poor impulse control, and lack of future-oriented thinking can lead criminals to sabotage their own crimes in ways that make prosecution easy and conviction virtually guaranteed, proving once again that while some criminals are sophisticated and difficult to catch, many are their own worst enemies, creating evidence trails and opportunities for apprehension through decisions that seem inexplicable to law-abiding citizens but are all too common among those whose judgment has been impaired by addiction, desperation, or simple failure to think through the consequences of their actions beyond the immediate moment. Number 8. The armed robber who forgot his mask in the store. In February 2014, a convenience store robbery in Portland, Oregon became a case study in criminal incompetence when the perpetrator managed to forget the most essential element of his disguise at the very scene of his crime, creating evidence that would lead to his arrest within hours. Marcus Chen, a 32-year-old unemployed construction worker who had been struggling with gambling debts and facing eviction from his apartment, decided that robbing a 7-Eleven store in the early morning hours would solve his immediate financial problems, and he spent several days planning what he believed would be a simple and profitable crime that would net him enough cash to cover his rent, and buy some time to get his life back on track. Chun purchased a black ski mask from a sporting goods store specifically for the robbery, and he also acquired a realistic-looking BB gun that he planned to use to intimidate the clerk, and on the night of February 18th, he drove to a 7-Eleven location on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard that he had scouted previously and knew had only one employee working the overnight shift. Chun parked his car several blocks away and walked to the store, pulling on the ski mask just before entering through the front door at approximately 3:30 in the morning, a time when the store was typically empty of customers and the clerk would be alone and vulnerable. The clerk on duty, a 19-year-old college student named David Park who was working the overnight shift to help pay for tuition, looked up from his textbook as Chen entered, and immediately recognized that something was wrong when he saw the masked man approaching the counter with one hand concealed in his jacket pocket in a way that suggested he might have a weapon. Chen approached the counter and in a voice he tried to make sound threatening demanded that Park empty the cash register, pulling out the BB gun and pointing it at the clerk to emphasize his seriousness, and Park, following the training he had received during his brief employment with the company, immediately complied without resistance, opening the register and placing all the bills into a plastic bag that Chun had brought with him for exactly this purpose. The entire robbery took less than 2 minutes from the time Chen entered the store to the moment he fled with approximately $380 in cash, and during that time, the store's security cameras captured clear footage of the masked robber, though the ski mask concealed his facial features and would have made identification difficult if that had been the only evidence available. Chun rushed out of the store and began walking quickly back toward where he had parked his car, and in his adrenaline-fueled state and his eagerness to escape the area before police arrived, he reached up and pulled off the ski mask because it was hot and uncomfortable and was making it difficult for him to see clearly in the darkness, stuffing the mask into his jacket pocket as he walked through the quiet residential streets. However, in his haste and nervous excitement, Chun failed to properly secure the mask in his pocket, and as he walked, the ski mask slipped out and fell onto the sidewalk behind him. But he was so focused on getting to his car and leaving the area that he never noticed he had dropped it, continuing on for several blocks before getting into his vehicle and driving away, believing he had successfully completed the robbery without leaving any evidence that could identify him. Meanwhile, back at the 7-Eleven, Park had immediately called 911 after Chen left, and Portland police officers arrived at the scene within minutes to take his statement and review the security footage, which showed the robbery in clear detail but provided limited identifying information due to the mask covering the suspect's face. Officers began canvassing the area on foot, looking for any evidence the robber might have left behind or any witnesses who might have seen someone suspicious in the neighborhood. And approximately 3 blocks from the store, one officer noticed what appeared to be a black ski mask lying on the sidewalk near a bus stop, an item that seemed out of place and potentially significant given that they were investigating a robbery committed by someone wearing exactly such a mask. The officer carefully picked up the ski mask using gloved hands and examined it, immediately noticing that it appeared to be recently worn based on its condition and the presence of what looked like fresh sweat stains on the interior fabric, and even more significantly, there were several strands of dark hair caught in the fabric of the mask, hair that could potentially be tested for DNA and compared against databases to identify the robber. The mask was immediately bagged as evidence and sent to the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory for analysis, where technicians were able to extract DNA from both the sweat stains and the hair samples, and when that DNA profile was run through the combined DNA index system, it came back with a match to Marcus Chen, who had been arrested 5 years earlier for a DUI and had his DNA collected and entered into the database as was standard procedure in Oregon for all felony arrests. Armed with this information, detectives pulled Chen's driver's license photo and showed it to Park, the 7-Eleven clerk, and while Park couldn't make a positive identification based on facial features since the robber had been masked, He was able to confirm that Chen's height, build, and general appearance were consistent with the person who had robbed him. Detectives also obtained Chen's vehicle registration information and began looking for his car, and within hours, they located it parked outside his apartment building in southeast Portland, and a careful examination of the exterior showed what appeared to be the same vehicle captured on a traffic camera near the 7-Eleven at the time of the robbery, though the footage was too grainy to make out license plate numbers definitively. Officers obtained a search warrant for Chen's apartment based on the DNA evidence from the mask, the witness description, and the vehicle sighting, and when they executed the warrant the following morning, they found Chen asleep in his bed with the stolen $380 in cash still in his jacket pocket hanging in the closet, along with the BB gun used in the robbery hidden under his mattress, and the plastic bag he had used to collect the money sitting in his kitchen trash can. Chen was arrested and initially denied any involvement in the robbery, claiming the DNA evidence must have been contaminated or that someone had stolen his ski mask and used it in the crime. But when confronted with the security footage showing a person matching his exact build and clothing, the DNA evidence placing him at the scene, and the stolen money and weapon found in his apartment, he eventually broke down and confessed, explaining that he had dropped the mask during his escape and hadn't realized it until he got home, at which point he had been too afraid to go back and retrieve it, knowing that police would likely be searching the area. Chen was charged with first-degree robbery, a Measure 11 offense in Oregon that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 90 months in prison with no possibility of early release. And he also faced charges of unlawful use of a weapon for brandishing the BB gun during the robbery, even though it was not a real firearm, because Oregon law treats realistic-looking replica weapons the same as actual guns when used to threaten or intimidate victims during crimes. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office prosecuted the case aggressively, arguing that Chen had planned the robbery in advance, had purchased materials specifically for the crime, and had terrorized a young clerk who was simply trying to earn money for college, and they pointed to the DNA evidence from the dropped mask as irrefutable proof of his guilt that made any defense impossible. Chen's public defender attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would reduce the charges and avoid the mandatory minimum sentence, but prosecutors refused to budge, insisting that the case deserved the full Measure 11 sentence and that they would take it to trial if necessary. Confident that the combination of DNA evidence, security footage, recovered stolen property, and Chen's own confession would result in an easy conviction. In August 2014, Chen pleaded guilty to first-degree robbery in exchange for dismissal of the weapons charge, and he was sentenced to exactly 90 months in Oregon State Prison with no early release, a sentence that the judge described as mandatory under state law but also entirely appropriate for someone who planned and executed an armed robbery that could easily have ended in tragedy if the victim had resisted or if the situation had escalated. During the sentencing hearing, Park gave a victim impact statement describing how the robbery had affected him, explaining that he had suffered from nightmares and anxiety following the incident and had ultimately quit his job at the 7-Eleven because he could no longer feel safe working alone at night. And he noted that while he was grateful the robber had been caught, the experience had changed him and made him much more fearful and less trusting than he had been before. The case became well known in Portland law enforcement circles as an example of how criminals often sabotage their own crimes through careless mistakes, and it was used in training seminars to illustrate the importance of thorough crime scene processing and area searches, as the officer who found the mask had simply been doing routine canvassing and might easily have missed it if he hadn't been paying close attention to his surroundings. The DNA evidence from the ski mask was particularly significant because it represented one of the first major cases in Portland where touch DNA and hair samples from abandoned clothing had been the primary evidence leading to identification and conviction, and the success of the prosecution helped establish precedents for how such evidence would be collected and used in future cases. Chen served his full 90-month sentence at the Oregon State Correctional Institution in Salem, and according to prison records, he participated in educational programs and maintained a relatively clean disciplinary record, and upon his release in 2021, he was placed on 3 years of post-prison supervision with requirements including regular meetings with a parole officer, prohibitions on possessing weapons of any kind, and restrictions on entering any convenience stores or similar businesses, without explicit permission from his supervising officer. The 7-Eleven where the robbery occurred remained in operation and implemented additional security measures including a second camera system with higher resolution, panic buttons at multiple locations behind the counter, and a policy of having 2 employees on duty during overnight hours rather than leaving a single person working alone. Changes that the company made system-wide after reviewing the incident and recognizing the vulnerability of solo overnight workers. Park, the clerk who had been robbed, eventually returned to school full-time and graduated with his degree, though he told friends and family that the robbery had been a turning point in his life that made him realize how quickly situations can turn dangerous and how important it is to prioritize personal safety over any job or material possessions. Lessons he said he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The ski mask that Chacon had dropped, after being used as evidence in the trial, was retained in the Portland Police Bureau's evidence storage facility where it remains today as part of the permanent case file, occasionally brought out for training purposes to show new officers and forensic technicians how a single piece of overlooked evidence can solve an entire case. Criminologists who studied Chen's case noted that his mistake of dropping the mask represented a classic example of how the stress and adrenaline of committing a crime can impair cognitive function and attention to detail, causing criminals to make errors they would never make under normal circumstances. And they also pointed out that Chen's decision to remove the mask so soon after the robbery, before he had reached the safety of his vehicle, showed poor planning and a failure to anticipate how he might react emotionally and physically to the experience of committing armed robbery. Today, more than 10 years after Marcus Chun robbed a Portland 7-Eleven and then dropped his DNA-laden ski mask 3 blocks away, the case remains a frequently cited example of how modern forensic science combined with simple police work can solve crimes that might have gone unsolved in previous eras, and it serves as a reminder that criminals who believe they can commit perfect crimes often overlook the smallest details that ultimately lead to their capture, proving that in an age where DNA databases and security cameras are ubiquitous, the margin for error for criminals has become vanishingly small, and a single dropped item containing biological evidence can transform an anonymous masked robber into an identified, convicted felon serving nearly 8 years in prison. Number 9. The shoplifter who posted her haul on Instagram. In July 2019, a serial shoplifter in Miami, Florida made the fatal mistake of documenting her crimes on social media, posting photographs and videos of stolen merchandise to her Instagram account with such frequency and detail that she essentially created a comprehensive visual catalog of her criminal activity that law enforcement would later use to secure multiple felony convictions. Jasmine Rodriguez, a 24-year-old who had developed a following on Instagram by posting fashion and lifestyle content, had been shoplifting from high-end retail stores throughout Miami-Dade County for nearly 6 months, targeting designer boutiques, department stores, and specialty shops where she would steal clothing, handbags, cosmetics, and accessories that she would then photograph herself wearing or using, posting the images to her Instagram account with captions that bragged about her shopping sprees and her ability to obtain luxury goods without actually paying for them. Rodriguez had developed a sophisticated approach to shoplifting that involved wearing oversized clothing with hidden pockets, carrying large handbags that she would stuff with merchandise, and working with an accomplice who would distract store employees while Rodriguez concealed items, and she had become so successful and confident in her methods that she began to believe she was untouchable, and that retailers were either too incompetent or too understaffed to catch her. What Rodriguez failed to realize was that loss prevention officers from multiple stores had been comparing notes and had identified a pattern of thefts that seemed to be connected based on the type of merchandise being stolen, the time of day the thefts occurred, and witness descriptions of a young Hispanic woman with distinctive tattoos who was frequently seen in the stores around the time items went missing. In June 2019, a loss prevention officer from Nordstrom who had been tracking Rodriguez's activities decided to search social media for anyone posting about luxury shopping in the Miami area. And within minutes of searching Instagram hashtags related to designer brands and Miami shopping, she discovered Rodriguez's account, which featured dozens of posts showing Rodriguez wearing or displaying items that exactly matched merchandise that had been reported stolen from Nordstrom and other stores in recent months. The loss prevention officer could hardly believe what she was seeing, as Rodriguez had essentially created a photographic record of her crimes, complete with timestamps and location tags that placed her in specific stores on specific dates. And many of the posts included captions where Rodriguez explicitly stated that she had finessed or got over on stores, slang terms that clearly indicated she had stolen rather than purchased the items. The officer immediately compiled screenshots of Rodriguez's Instagram posts and created a detailed report matching specific posts to specific theft incidents, noting that in several photographs, Rodriguez was wearing items that still had security tags attached or was posing with shopping bags from stores where surveillance footage showed her leaving without making any purchases, evidence that would be devastating in any prosecution. This information was shared with Miami-Dade Police Department detectives who specialized in organized retail crime, and they began their own investigation into Rodriguez, obtaining search warrants for her Instagram account that would allow them to access metadata including the exact times and GPS locations where photos were taken, information that could be used to place Rodriguez at crime scenes and corroborate witness statements and surveillance footage. Detectives discovered that Rodriguez's Instagram account had over 15,000 followers, many of whom commented on her posts asking how she could afford such expensive items and complimenting her style. And Rodriguez often responded to these comments with winking emojis or cryptic references to knowing how to work the system, never explicitly confessing to theft in her comments, but certainly implying that she was obtaining merchandise through illegitimate means. The investigation expanded as detectives contacted loss prevention departments at every major retailer in the Miami area, and they found that Rodriguez was suspected in theft incidents at Bloomingdale's, Saks Fifth Avenue, Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, Macy's, and at least a dozen smaller boutiques, with total losses estimated at over $100,000 based on the retail value of stolen merchandise, though actual losses to the stores were somewhat less due to wholesale pricing and insurance recoveries. In August 2019, detectives felt they had gathered sufficient evidence to make arrests, and they executed search warrants at Rodriguez's apartment in Hialeah as well as a storage unit she had rented under a false name. And what they found exceeded even their expectations, as both locations were filled with stolen merchandise, much of it still bearing store security tags, price tags, and other evidence of theft, and hanging on racks and stacked in boxes as if Rodriguez had created her own personal boutique filled entirely with stolen goods. Detectives also seized Rodriguez's cell phone and laptop computer, which contained thousands of additional photographs of stolen items, some posted to Instagram and some apparently kept for her own records, as well as text messages between Rodriguez and her accomplice discussing specific stores to target, techniques for defeating security systems, and how to divide up stolen merchandise, communications that demonstrated clear conspiracy and planning rather than impulsive shoplifting. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with 23 counts of grand theft, organized scheme to defraud, and burglary of a structure, charges that collectively carried potential sentences of over 40 years in prison if she were convicted on all counts. And her accomplice, identified through the text messages and confirmed through surveillance footage as 26-year-old Maria Santos, was also arrested and charged with similar offenses. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office held a press conference to announce the arrests, and they displayed some of Rodriguez's Instagram posts on a screen behind the podium, showing the defendant posing with stolen merchandise and bragging about her activities. And the prosecutor noted that in his 15 years of handling retail theft cases, he had never seen a defendant who had so thoroughly documented their own crimes and created such a comprehensive evidence file against themselves. Rodriguez's defense attorney faced an almost impossible task, as the Instagram posts alone were damning enough to secure convictions, but combined with the recovered stolen merchandise, the surveillance footage from multiple stores, the testimony of loss prevention officers, and the text messages showing planning and conspiracy, the case against his client was airtight, and he advised her that accepting a plea deal would be her only realistic option to avoid spending decades in prison. The retailers who had been victimized by Rodriguez's shoplifting spree sent representatives to court proceedings, and several loss prevention officers gave statements describing the impact of organized retail crime on their businesses, noting that theft drives up prices for all consumers, costs jobs when stores have to cut staff to offset losses, and in some cases forces stores to close locations in areas where theft is particularly problematic, broader consequences that go far beyond the immediate loss of merchandise. In November 2019, Rodriguez accepted a plea agreement in which she pleaded no contest to 10 counts of grand theft and 1 count of organized scheme to defraud in exchange for dismissal of the remaining charges, and she was sentenced to 5 years in Florida State Prison followed by 10 years of probation, and she was also ordered to pay restitution to the affected retailers totaling $87,000, an amount that would take years if not decades to repay given her lack of employment and assets. The judge, during sentencing, specifically referenced Rodriguez's Instagram posts, stating that her decision to publicly brag about her crimes on social media showed an astounding lack of judgment and a complete disregard for the law, and noted that while many criminals try to hide their activities, Rodriguez had actively advertised hers, behavior that suggested she felt entitled to steal and believed she would face no consequences, an attitude that the court found particularly troubling and deserving of a significant prison sentence. Rodriguez's Instagram account was eventually deleted either by her or by Instagram's parent company Meta after the account was reported multiple times for featuring criminal activity, but screenshots of her posts had been preserved as evidence and were maintained in the court file, and some of the more egregious examples were used in retail loss prevention training seminars as cautionary tales about how social media has changed the landscape of retail crime investigation. Santos, Rodriguez's accomplice, received a slightly lesser sentence of 3 years in prison followed by probation after cooperating with investigators and providing testimony about how their shoplifting operation worked, and she admitted that Rodriguez had recruited her into the scheme and had taught her shoplifting techniques, though prosecutors noted that Santos was an adult who had made her own choices and deserved punishment despite her cooperation. The case drew significant media attention both locally in Miami and nationally, with news outlets fascinated by the story of a shoplifter who had posted her stolen goods on Instagram for thousands of followers to see, and the coverage sparked discussions about social media culture, the desire for validation through posts and likes, and how platforms like Instagram can inadvertently encourage illegal behavior when users become more focused on their online image than on the real world. Consequences of their actions. Criminologists and retail crime experts analyzed the case and noted that Rodriguez represented a growing trend of criminals, particularly younger ones, who document their crimes on social media either out of a desire for attention and status, or because they have grown up in an era where constantly posting about one's life is so normalized that they do it automatically without considering that law enforcement might be watching, and experts warn that this trend makes social media an increasingly valuable tool for investigators while also representing a troubling development in how criminals think about risk and consequences. Rodriguez is currently serving her sentence at Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, and according to prison records, she has accumulated several disciplinary infractions including possession of contraband and unauthorized communication with outside contacts, suggesting that she has struggled to adjust to prison life and may not be using her incarceration as an opportunity for reflection and rehabilitation. The retailers who were victimized by Rodriguez's shoplifting spree have collectively implemented new security measures including improved camera systems, undercover loss prevention officers who monitor social media for posts featuring their merchandise, and information-sharing networks that allow stores to communicate about suspected shoplifters and organized retail crime rings, adaptations that have helped reduce theft but have also increased operational costs that are ultimately passed on to consumers through higher prices. Upon her eventual release, Rodriguez will face a decade of probation during which she will be prohibited from entering retail stores without permission from her probation officer, will be required to maintain employment and make monthly restitution payments, and will be subject to random searches of her residence and any electronic devices, and any violation of these conditions could send her back to prison to serve the remainder of her sentence plus additional time for the probation violation. Today, more than 5 years after Jasmine Rodriguez was arrested for posting photographs of stolen merchandise to her Instagram account, the case remains one of the most frequently cited examples of how social media has transformed criminal investigations, and it serves as a warning to would-be criminals that documenting illegal activities online is essentially the same as creating evidence for prosecutors, and that the desire for social media validation and online fame can lead directly to prison time when the activities being posted about are crimes, proving that in the digital age, the permanent and public nature of social media posts means that criminals who choose to brag about their exploits online are not just risking arrest, but are actively participating in building the case against themselves, creating time-stamped, geotagged, photographic evidence that makes prosecution simple and conviction nearly certain. Number 10. The bank robber who left his resume on the counter. In March 2021, a bank robbery in Sacramento, California became one of the most bizarre and self-incriminating cases in recent law enforcement history when the perpetrator inadvertently left behind a document that provided investigators with essentially everything they needed to identify, locate, and arrest him within a matter of hours. Nathan Powell, a 35-year-old who had been unemployed for over a year following the loss of his job as a warehouse supervisor during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, had been struggling to find new employment despite submitting applications to dozens of companies, and his unemployment benefits had run out months earlier, leaving him facing eviction, utility shutoffs, and mounting debt that had driven him to consider increasingly desperate measures to obtain money. Powell had never committed a serious crime before, with only a few traffic violations and one arrest for public intoxication years earlier, but in March 2021, facing what he saw as insurmountable financial pressure, he decided that robbing a bank would be his solution, believing that he could walk in, demand money, and walk out with enough cash to cover his immediate expenses and buy time to find legitimate employment, a plan that demonstrated both his desperation and his complete lack of understanding about how bank robberies actually work and how frequently robbers are caught. On the morning of March 15th, Powell spent several hours preparing for what he planned to be his first and only bank robbery, and as part of that preparation, he decided to print out several copies of his resume because he planned to stop at a few businesses after the robbery to submit job applications, reasoning that he should use the time productively and that having cash from the robbery would help him survive while he waited to hear back about employment opportunities. A bizarre combination of criminal planning and job hunting that would ultimately prove to be his downfall. Powell gathered the materials he thought he would need for the robbery, including a hooded sweatshirt to partially conceal his face, sunglasses to hide his eyes, a handwritten note demanding money, and the printed resumes that he placed in a folder with his other papers, and around 11 a.m., he drove to a Wells Fargo branch on Fulton Avenue in Sacramento, parking in the lot and taking a few moments to build up his courage before walking inside. The bank was moderately busy with about 6 customers waiting in line and 3 tellers working behind the counter, and Powell joined the line, clutching his folder of papers and trying to look casual despite the anxiety that was making his hands shake and causing him to sweat profusely even though the bank was comfortably air-conditioned. When Powell reached the front of the line and approached a teller station, he opened his folder to retrieve the demand note he had written, but in his nervous state, he accidentally pulled out both the demand note and one of his resumes, placing both documents on the counter and sliding them toward the teller, a young woman named Amanda Chacon who had been working at the bank for about 8 months. Chacon looked down at the papers Powell had placed in front of her and was confused to see what appeared to be a typed resume with Powell's full name, address, phone number, email address, work history, and references clearly printed at the top, alongside a handwritten note that read, "Put all the money in an envelope. Don't say anything, I have a gun." And for a moment she wasn't sure which document she was supposed to be responding to or if this was some kind of strange mistake. Powell, realizing immediately that he had accidentally included his resume with the demand note, reached across the counter and tried to grab the resume back, but Chun instinctively pulled both documents away from his reach, and in that moment of confusion and panic, Powell made the decision that he needed to flee rather than continue with the robbery. So he turned and hurried out of the bank without taking any money, leaving both the demand note and his resume on the counter in front of the bewildered teller. Chun immediately pressed the silent alarm button and called for her supervisor, showing both documents and explaining what had just happened, and the supervisor, after a moment of stunned disbelief, called 911 and reported the attempted robbery, while also noting that they had the suspect's complete identifying information including his home address thanks to the resume he had left behind. Sacramento police officers arrived at the Wells Fargo within minutes, and when they were shown the resume with Powell's information alongside the demand note, they exchanged looks of amazement, with one officer later telling reporters that in his 20 years of law enforcement, he had never encountered a bank robber who had literally handed over his personal information, contact details, and employment history as part of an attempted robbery, making it the easiest case he had ever worked. While some officers remained at the bank to interview witnesses and review security footage that clearly showed Powell approaching the counter and accidentally providing his resume, other units were dispatched directly to the address listed on the resume, an apartment in the Arden Arcade neighborhood of Sacramento, and they arrived to find Powell's car, which matched the vehicle seen on bank parking lot surveillance cameras, parked in the designated space. Officers knocked on Powell's apartment door, and when he answered, they could immediately see that he was wearing the same clothing visible in the bank security footage, and when asked if he was Nathan Powell, he confirmed his identity with such a defeated expression that officers knew he understood exactly why they were there and that any attempt to deny involvement would be pointless. Powell was asked if he had been at the Wells Fargo on Fulton Avenue earlier that morning, and after a long pause and with tears beginning to form in his eyes, he admitted that yes, He had been there and had attempted to rob the bank but had panicked and left without taking anything. And he also volunteered without being asked that he had accidentally left his resume on the counter, a mistake he had realized immediately upon returning to his apartment, and one that had left him sitting in his living room for the past hour waiting for police to arrive because he knew there was no point in running. Officers arrested Powell and transported him to the Sacramento County Main Jail for booking and processing, and during the ride, he repeatedly apologized and explained that he had never intended to hurt anyone and had only been trying to get money to avoid being evicted, explanations that officers listened to politely but which they knew would have no bearing on the charges he would face or the prosecution's approach to the case. A search of Powell's apartment, conducted with his consent after he was advised that refusing would only result in a warrant being obtained, revealed the hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses he had worn to partially disguise himself, the folder that had contained both his demand note and the resumes, and his computer with browser history showing that he had been researching bank robbery techniques and reading news articles about successful and unsuccessful robberies, evidence that demonstrated premeditation and planning despite the ultimate incompetence of his execution. Powell was charged with attempted robbery and attempted grand theft, both felonies under California law, and while he had not actually obtained any money or explicitly displayed a weapon, the demand notes claim that he had a gun was sufficient to elevate the charges and increase the potential sentence he faced, even though investigators found no evidence that Powell actually possessed any firearm and believed the threat had been a bluff designed to make the teller comply more quickly. The Wells Fargo branch where the attempted robbery occurred remained open for business throughout the investigation, and while the incident had been frightening for employees and customers present during the attempt, the rapid resolution and the almost comical nature of Powell leaving his resume behind helped reduce some of the anxiety that typically follows bank robberies, though the bank still conducted debriefing sessions with staff and reinforced protocols for responding to robbery attempts. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office prosecuted Powell's case, and while prosecutors acknowledged that the attempted robbery had been unusually incompetent and that Powell had clearly been acting out of desperation rather than as a career criminal, they also noted that he had planned the crime in advance, had made threats implying he was armed, and had terrorized bank employees and customers regardless of whether he ultimately took any money, factors that deserved serious punishment. Powell's public defender argued for leniency based on his client's lack of prior serious criminal history, his obvious mental and emotional distress related to unemployment and financial hardship, and the fact that his immediate flight from the bank and subsequent cooperation with police demonstrated that he had realized the gravity of his mistake and had not persisted in criminal behavior, and the defender also noted that Powell's decision to include his resume with the robbery note, while incredibly foolish, also demonstrated how disconnected from reality his thinking had become due to stress and desperation. In July 2021, Powell accepted a plea agreement in which he pleaded no contest to attempted robbery in exchange for dismissal of the theft charge, and he was sentenced to 2 years in county jail with credit for time served followed by 3 years of formal probation, a sentence that the judge described as more lenient than the crime might typically warrant, but appropriate given the unique circumstances, Powell's cooperation, his lack of criminal history, and the fact that no money had actually been taken and no one had been physically harmed. The judge, during sentencing, specifically addressed Powell's resume mistake, saying, "Mr. Powell, you came to court today to face the consequences of attempting to rob a bank while simultaneously trying to find honest employment, and you did so by accidentally providing your complete contact information to your intended victim. This is perhaps the clearest example I have ever seen of someone whose better judgment was fighting against their worst impulses, and the fact that you literally handed over your resume suggests that on some level, you knew what you were doing was wrong and your mind was trying to sabotage your own criminal behavior." Powell served his sentence at the Sacramento County Main Jail, and according to jail records, he participated in educational programs, received counseling for financial stress and decision-making, and worked with employment counselors who helped him develop a legitimate job search strategy for when he was released, and by all accounts he was a model inmate who expressed genuine remorse and worked seriously on addressing the issues that had led to his crime. Upon his release in 2023, Powell was placed on probation with requirements including regular check-ins with a probation officer, maintenance of employment or active job searching, participation in financial literacy classes and community service, and according to his probation officer's reports, he has remained compliant and has found employment in retail management, Work that, while not as well-paying as his previous warehouse supervisor position, has been stable and sufficient to meet his basic needs. The resume that Powell accidentally left at the bank was preserved as evidence and became something of a curiosity within the Sacramento law enforcement community, with copies circulating among officers and being used in training presentations about unusual cases, and the story has been told and retold at professional conferences as an example of how criminals sometimes sabotage their own crimes in ways that seem almost designed to ensure their capture. The Wells Fargo teller who received both the demand note and the resume gave media interviews about the bizarre experience, describing her initial confusion about which document she was supposed to respond to and her relief that the would-be robber had fled without violence or taking anything. And she noted that the incident had taught her that not all criminals are hardened or dangerous, and that sometimes people commit crimes out of sheer desperation without any real understanding of what they're doing or what the consequences will be. Career counselors and employment experts who learned about Powell's case used it as a cautionary tale in job search workshops, noting that while his method of combining a job search with a bank robbery was obviously extreme and illegal, it did reflect the genuine desperation that long-term unemployed workers can feel when they're facing financial collapse, and they emphasized the importance of seeking legitimate help through social services, unemployment programs, and community resources rather than turning to crime when employment situations become dire. Today, more than 3 years after Nathan Powell attempted to rob a Sacramento Wells Fargo while accidentally leaving his resume on the counter, the case remains one of the most frequently referenced examples of criminal self-sabotage, cited in law enforcement circles, legal discussions, and even in popular culture as a story that perfectly encapsulates how stress, poor planning, and cognitive dissonance can cause criminals to inadvertently create the evidence that leads to their own arrest and conviction. And while Powell's case ended with a relatively lenient sentence and an opportunity for rehabilitation, it serves as a permanent reminder that desperate situations do not justify criminal actions, and that the human mind, even when trying to commit crimes, sometimes rebels against those intentions in ways that ensure justice is served, proving once again that criminals are often their own worst enemies, and that sometimes the best detective work is simply being present when suspects hand over comprehensive dossiers of their personal information along with their demands for money, making arrest and prosecution not a matter of investigation but simply a matter of following the address printed at the top of a carefully formatted resume. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.